The first time Reece Jameson heard genuine laughter echo through his weathered barn in nearly a decade, he nearly put a bullet through the floorboards. It was 1879 in Montana Territory, and unexpected visitors usually meant trouble, not joy. Reece lowered his Winchester rifle cautiously, squinting through the dusty shafts of sunlight that streamed between the barn boards. A woman stood with her back to him, running her hand along the neck of his chestnut mare. Her shoulders shook with laughter as the horse nuzzled against her palm, searching for treats. "Folks generally don't wander into a man's barn uninvited," Reece said, his voice rusty from disuse. The woman spun around, startled but not frightened. She was perhaps 25, with honey-colored hair tied loosely at her nape and eyes that reminded him of the Montana sky in spring. "I apologize," she said, composing herself quickly. "Your fence was down, and I saw the horse, looking lonely. I thought someone ought to check." She tilted her head, studying him. "Are you Mr. Jameson?" He nodded once, rifle still in hand though lowered now. "Most just call me Reece." "I'm Emma Valentine," she said, stepping forward with an extended hand like she was in some Eastern parlor rather than a dilapidated barn in the middle of nowhere. "I purchased the Miller property. We're neighbors now." Reece stared at her hand for a long moment before awkwardly shifting his rifle to extend his own. Her grip was surprisingly firm, her skin warm despite the autumn chill. "Miller's been gone 3 years," he said flatly. "Yes, the property's been vacant. I bought it from his son back east." She glanced around the barn, her eyes taking in the broken stalls, the leaking roof. "It seems maintaining fences isn't the custom out here." Despite himself, Reece felt the corner of his mouth twitch. Maintaining anything takes time a man alone doesn't always have. "Well," Emma said, straightening her simple blue dress, "you're not alone in these parts anymore. I'll be fixing up the Miller place. Starting tomorrow." Reece frowned. "Madam, Emma," she corrected. "Miss Valentine," he continued stubbornly, "a woman alone can't manage a homestead in this territory." Her laugh returned, bright and incongruous in his gloomy barn. "Mr. Jameson, I've been managing alone since I was 16. But I appreciate your concern." She moved toward the barn door, pausing beside him. "Your mare needs her hooves trimmed, by the way. Good day." She left as suddenly as she'd appeared, the scent of lavender lingering in the stale barn air. Reece stood motionless, rifle in hand, wondering what sort of whirlwind had just blown through his carefully constructed solitude. The next morning, Reece found himself riding toward the Miller property for the first time in years. He told himself it was neighborly concern, nothing more. The woman clearly had no idea what she was getting into. Winter in Montana would kill her as surely as any outlaw if she wasn't prepared. The Miller homestead came into view, its weathered cabins standing starkly against the expansive landscape. To his surprise, smoke already curled from the chimney, and the porch that had been sagging for years appeared to have fresh supports. As he approached, he spotted Emma on the roof, hammer in hand, replacing shingles with practiced movements. She glanced up at the sound of his horse, shielding her eyes against the morning sun. "Mr. Jameson," she called down, "what brings you by?" He dismounted, feeling foolish now. "Thought you might need help," he said gruffly. "Winter's coming." "Indeed it is." She made her way to the edge of the roof and climbed down a ladder with ease. "I've been working since dawn." Up close, he could see smudges of dirt on her face, her hair tied back practically beneath a kerchief. She wore men's trousers and a flannel shirt that had seen better days. Nothing like the proper lady who'd visited his barn. "You know how to roof?" he asked skeptically. "My father was a carpenter in Ohio before the consumption took him," she said matter-of-factly. "I helped with his business for years." She gestured to the cabin. "Would you like some coffee? It's the least I can offer for your neighborly concern." Inside, the cabin was transformed from the abandoned shell he remembered. Though sparse, it was clean, with a few pieces of simple furniture and crates yet to be unpacked. A cast iron stove radiated welcome heat. "How did you get all this out here?" he asked, accepting a tin cup of surprisingly good coffee. "Wagon train from Fort Benton," she replied, pouring her own cup. "I arrived last week and stayed in town until I could arrange transport for my things." "Alone?" Her eyes met his over the rim of her cup. "Yes, Mr. Jameson. Alone." They sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the distant call of birds outside. "Why here?" he finally asked. "There's nothing in these parts but hardship." Emma set down her cup. "Perhaps that's what I'm looking for." She offered no further explanation, instead changing the subject. "The eastern fence line is completely down. I suspect your cattle have been grazing my land for some time." "Possibly," Reece admitted. "I'll help you repair it." She smiled then, a genuine expression that transformed her face. "I would appreciate that, Mr. Jameson." "Reece," he corrected, surprising himself. "Reece," she repeated softly. They fell into an unexpected rhythm over the following weeks. Each morning, Reece would arrive at Emma's homestead, bringing tools or supplies from town. They worked side by side mending fences, reinforcing the barn, preparing her small plot for the coming winter. Emma proved herself more capable than most men Reece had known. She could split wood, mend leather, and handle a rifle with precision. Yet there was a gentleness to her that he found increasingly disarming. The way she spoke softly to skittish animals, the flowers she'd planted by her front door despite the impracticality, the books that filled one precious trunk she'd brought from back east. "You're staring again," Emma said one afternoon as they worked together replacing the cabin's window frames. Reece quickly looked away, focusing intently on the wood in his hands. "Just making sure you don't hammer your thumb," he muttered. "I've managed to avoid that fate for 26 years, she replied with amusement. "Though, I appreciate your vigilance." 26. The number settled in his mind. 8 years younger than his 34. Not that it mattered. "Will you stay for supper?" she asked, changing the subject. "I've got a rabbit stew that's been simmering all day." He should say no. He'd been spending too much time here already, neglecting his own place. But the thought of returning to his empty cabin held little appeal compared to another hour in Emma's company. "If it's no trouble," he said. Her smile was worth his momentary weakness. No trouble at all. Over dinner, seated at Emma's small table with real china plates she'd carefully unpacked, Reece found himself talking more than he had in years. He told her about coming west after the war, about building his small ranch from nothing, about the harsh winters and brief, glorious summers. "And no family?" Emma asked gently, refilling his coffee cup. Reece stared into the dark liquid. "Had a wife once. Sarah. She died in childbed our second year here. The baby too." He hadn't spoken of them aloud in so long the words felt foreign on his tongue. Emma's hand briefly touched his across the table. "I'm sorry. It was a long time ago," he said, though the pain had merely dulled, never truly vanished. "Is that why you keep to yourself? Why your land shows years of neglect?" He should have been angry at her directness, but found he couldn't muster the emotion. "Suppose so. Didn't see much point in building something with no one to share it." Emma looked around her small cabin, the improvements they'd made together evident in every corner. "I understand loneliness, Reece. I lost my family too, father to consumption, mother to grief shortly after. My only brother to the war." Her eyes met his. "But I refused to stop living because of it." Her words stayed with him that night as he rode home under a canopy of stars. For the first time in years, he looked at his neglected ranch with fresh eyes, seeing not just what it was, but what it could be. What it had once been meant to be, before grief had hollowed him out. The first snow came early that year, a biting November storm that painted the landscape white overnight. Reece woke with a start, his first thought not of his own cattle, but of Emma. He saddled his horse in the pre-dawn darkness and rode through deepening drifts to her homestead. He found her already outside, clearing a path from her door to the barn, wrapped in layers against the cold. "I was coming to check on you," he called over the wind. Emma looked up, her cheeks flushed with cold and exertion. "As you can see, I'm managing fine," she shouted back, but the smile that accompanied her words held no rebuke. Together they tended her small collection of animals, 2 milk cows, a half-dozen chickens, and an elderly mule she'd purchased from a widow in town. Inside the cabin afterward, warming by the fire, Emma handed him a steaming mug of coffee laced with something stronger. "A medicinal necessity on days like this," she explained when he raised an eyebrow at the whiskey's bite. The storm raged for 3 days. Reece stayed, sleeping on a pallet by the fire while Emma took the small bedroom. They fell into a comfortable domesticity that should have frightened him but instead felt like stepping into a warm room after years in the cold. On the 3rd night, as the wind finally began to ease, they sat side by side before the fire, a worn quilt spread across both their laps. "Tell me about before," Emma said softly. "Before Montana. Before the war." And so he did. He told her about growing up in Pennsylvania, his father's small farm, his mother's garden. He spoke of joining the Union Army at 19, of the horrors he'd seen, of his determination to find unspoiled land afterward. Words he hadn't spoken in a decade poured from him like water from a broken dam. "I wanted to build something untouched by all that death," he finished. "Somewhere to forget." Emma's hand found his beneath the quilt. Did it work? The forgetting. Reece shook his head slowly.
"No.
Just brought different ghosts." "Perhaps," Emma said carefully, "you weren't meant to forget. Perhaps you were meant to remember, but also to continue living." Her fingers intertwined with his, warm and real in a way nothing had felt in years. Reece looked at their joined hands, then at her face, gilded by firelight. "Emma," he began, not knowing what would follow her name. She saved him from finding out by leaning forward and pressing her lips softly against his. A brief touch, gone almost before he registered it. "I should turn in," she whispered, rising from beside him. At the bedroom door she paused, looking back. "Good night, Reece." He sat long into the night, the ghost of her kiss more real than anything he'd felt in years. When the snow finally cleared enough to travel safely, Reece reluctantly returned to his own homestead. The place seemed colder, emptier than before. He spent the day in a flurry of long-neglected activity repairing his own roof, splitting extra firewood, taking inventory of supplies that would see him through winter. As twilight approached, he stood on his porch looking toward the direction of Emma's homestead, now hidden beyond the rolling hills. The thought of another solitary night felt suddenly unbearable. Before he could reconsider, he saddled his horse and rode through the fading light. Stars were beginning to appear when Emma's cabin came into view, lamplight glowing warmly from the windows. She opened the door before he could knock, as if she'd been watching for him. "I thought you might come," she said simply, stepping aside to let him enter. The cabin was warm, fragrant with the scent of baking bread. On her small table sat 2 place settings, a candle burning between them. "I hoped," she clarified, a hint of vulnerability crossing her features. Reece stood just inside the door, hat in hand, suddenly uncertain. "Emma, I'm not. I haven't." He struggled to find the words. "I'm not the man I was before. Before everything." She crossed to him, taking his weather-roughened hands in her smaller ones. "I don't know that man, Reece. I know you, the man who rides through snowstorms to check on neighbors, who works from dawn till dusk mending fences that aren't his responsibility, who speaks to horses more gently than he speaks to himself." Her eyes held his. "That's the man I've come to care for." "I'm 8 years older than you," he said, grasping at practical objections when his heart was already surrendering. Emma laughed, the sound that had first captivated him in his dusty barn. Is that your strongest argument? Because if so, you've already lost this debate. Something tight in his chest loosened, and Reece found himself smiling a real smile that reached places long dormant within him. I suppose I have. Through the winter months, they developed a pattern. 3 or 4 days at his ranch, tending his larger herd and making repairs long postponed. Then 3 or 4 at hers, working on improvements to the Miller place. The bitter Montana winter that had once seemed endless to Reece now passed in a blur of shared meals, evening conversations, and increasingly passionate embraces. Emma brought laughter back into his life, genuine, unrestrained joy that he'd forgotten was possible. She filled the silence of his days with stories, questions, and occasionally spirited arguments when their stubborn natures clashed. "You're the most infuriating woman I've ever known," he told her one evening after a particularly heated debate about the merits of her experimental crop rotation plan. "And yet," she replied smugly, settling against his chest before the fire, "you cannot seem to stay away from me." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "A curse I seem unable to break." As winter began its slow surrender to spring, Reece found himself contemplating a future he hadn't dared imagine in years. The thought of Emma returning to her cabin while he remained at his grew increasingly intolerable. Yet he hesitated to speak of permanence, uncertain if she'd welcome such a proposition. The decision was forced when, in early April, Emma fell ill. What began as a simple cold quickly developed into a fever that left her weak and disoriented. Reece rode breakneck to town for the doctor, fear clawing at his throat in a way he hadn't experienced since Sarah. Dr. Wells was blunt after examining her. "Pneumonia. It's touch and go for the next few days." For 3 days and nights, Reece barely left Emma's bedside, cooling her burning forehead with damp cloths, forcing broth between her cracked lips when she was lucid enough to swallow. He bargained with God, with fate, with whatever powers might be listening. Not again. Please, not again. On the 4th night, her fever finally broke. Reece, half asleep in a chair beside her bed, jerked awake when he felt her fingers weakly squeezing his. "You look terrible," Emma whispered, her voice hoarse but her eyes clear for the first time in days. Relief crashed through him with such force he could barely speak. "Says the woman who's been at death's door." Her lips curved in a faint smile. "Did I worry you?" "Worry doesn't begin to cover it." He brought her hand to his lips. "I thought I might lose you." "I'm stronger than I look," she murmured, already drifting back to sleep, this time healing rather than fevered. "Not getting rid of me that easily." 2 more weeks passed before Emma was fully recovered. By then, spring had arrived in earnest, the landscape transformed by fresh green and wildflowers. On her first day strong enough for a proper outing, Reece saddled his gentlest mare for her and took her riding along the creek that divided their properties. They stopped to rest in a meadow scattered with purple and yellow blooms. Emma sat with her face tilted to the sun, color finally returning to her cheeks after her illness. "I need to ask you something," Reece said, uncharacteristic nervousness making his voice rougher than intended. Emma turned to him, a questioning look in her eyes. Reece took her hands in his. "These past months, having you in my life." He stopped, frustrated by his inability to articulate the emotions overwhelming him. "Damn it, Emma, I love you. I never thought I'd say those words to another woman, but there it is. I love you, and the thought of going back to life without you is unbearable." Tears welled in Emma's eyes, but a smile bloomed across her face. "I was beginning to wonder if you'd ever say it." "I'm saying it now," he replied, drawing her closer. "I want you with me not just some days, but every day. I want to wake up beside you and fall asleep with you in my arms. I want to build something together." "Are you asking me to marry you, Reece Jameson?" she asked, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "Yes," he said simply. though I'm making a poor job of it. Emma's laugh rang out across the meadow, the same laugh that had first lit up his barn and begun thawing his frozen heart. "Yes," she said, framing his face with her hands. "Yes, I will marry you. Though I warn you, I intend to keep working on my experimental crop rotations." Reece laughed then too, pulling her close. "I would expect nothing less." They were married in late May, a small ceremony in town with just the preacher, doctor, and a few neighbors as witnesses. Emma wore a simple blue dress that matched her eyes and carried wildflowers Reece had gathered that morning. He wore the only suit he owned, purchased years ago for a life he'd thought buried alongside Sarah. As they exchanged vows, Reece felt not the betrayal of memory he'd feared, but rather its peaceful coexistence with new joy. Sarah would always be part of his past, but Emma was his future, bright, unexpected, and precious beyond measure. They decided to make their home primarily at Reece's larger ranch, while maintaining Emma's homestead for her agricultural experiments. Together they worked that summer, repairing and expanding, transforming the neglected property into something that reflected both their visions. Emma convinced Reece to take on a hired hand, a young man named Thomas who had a good way with cattle and was eager to learn. With the extra help, they were able to increase the herd and properly maintain both properties. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch Reece had expanded and watch the sunset paint the Montana sky in impossible colors. Sometimes they talked for hours, planning and dreaming. Other times they sat in comfortable silence, Emma often reading aloud from one of her beloved books. "I never thanked you," Reece said one such evening in late summer, Emma's head resting against his shoulder. "For what?" she asked, looking up from her book. "For walking into my barn that day. For laughing." He traced the line of her jaw with gentle fingers. "For bringing me back to life when I didn't even realize I'd stopped living." Emma closed her book, turning to face him fully. "I should thank you too, then. I came here looking for purpose, for a place to belong after losing everything." Her eyes, honest as always, held his. "I found more than I dared hope for." As autumn approached, bringing with it a vibrant display of color across the landscape, Emma shared news that left Reece speechless with emotion. "A baby," he repeated after she told him one morning as dawn broke across the eastern sky. "You're certain?" "Dr. Wells confirmed it yesterday," she said, watching his reaction carefully. "It will be spring when the little one arrives." For a moment, old fear threatened to surface, memories of Sarah's pain, of the tiny grave he'd dug beside hers. But Emma's steady presence, her hand warm in his, anchored him to the present. "A child," he said again, wonder replacing fear as he placed his hand gently against her still, flat stomach. "Our child." Emma covered his hand with hers. "Are you happy?" In answer, Reece gathered her in his arms, his heart too full for words. Against her hair, he finally whispered, "Happier than I ever thought possible." That winter was the coldest in memory, with blizzards that lasted weeks and temperatures that froze everything solid. But inside their home, warmth prevailed. Emma's pregnancy progressed well, her body changing as their child grew within her. Reece found himself fascinated by every new development, both terrified and exhilarated by the approaching reality of fatherhood. On the rare clear days, they would walk their property together, planning expansions to accommodate their growing family. Emma insisted the baby would need siblings, a prospect that both daunted and delighted Reece. "A whole brood of Valentine Jamesons," he mused as they trudged through snow one bright February afternoon. God help the Montana Territory. Emma, now visibly carrying their child, laughed that infectious laugh that never failed to warm him from within. "They'll be magnificent, stubborn as their father and practical as their mother. Heaven help us if they inherit your argumentative nature along with my stubbornness," Reece countered, helping her over a drift. "They'll be perfect," Emma declared confidently. because they'll be ours. Spring came late that year, but when it finally arrived, it brought with it unexpected bounty. Emma's experimental wheat crop at her homestead yielded better than anyone had predicted. Reece's cattle herd, carefully tended through the harsh winter, produced a record number of healthy calves. And on a perfect May morning, with wildflowers once again carpeting the meadows, their daughter entered the world after a labor that left Reece aged by years, but ended in jubilation rather than tragedy. Sarah Emma Jameson, Emma suggested hours later, cradling their red-faced, squalling daughter against her breast. To honor your past and our future. Reece, overcome, could only nod as he gazed at his wife and child, this miraculous new life they'd created together. In his daughter's tiny features, he saw echoes of Emma, hints of himself, and something entirely new, a future stretching before them filled with possibilities he'd once stopped believing in. That summer, when their daughter was just 2 months old, Emma insisted on hosting a gathering at their ranch, the first such social event either property had seen in a decade. Neighbors from miles around came, bringing food and good wishes, filling the once silent homestead with conversation and laughter. As twilight fell, lanterns were lit around the yard, and someone produced a fiddle. Music spilled across the ranch, drawing couples to dance beneath the emerging stars. Reece stood on the porch, watching the scene with their sleeping daughter cradled carefully in his arms. Emma appeared beside him, her face flushed from dancing. "Is this what you pictured?" she asked, looking out at their transformed home, at the life they'd built in just over a year. "When you first came west, is this what you hoped to create?" Reece considered the question, thinking back to the idealistic young man who'd journeyed to Montana seeking a fresh start, then to the hollow shell he'd become after losing Sarah, existing rather than living for so many years. "No," he said honestly, looking down at their daughter's peaceful face, then at the woman who had saved him simply by refusing to let him remain broken. "This is better than anything I could have imagined." Emma slipped her arm around his waist, leaning her head against his shoulder as they watched their friends and neighbors dance beneath the Montana sky. "It's just the beginning," she promised. "Just the beginning of our story." And as the music played on, and their daughter slept peacefully in his arms, Reece knew with absolute certainty that Emma was right. The years of solitude were behind him. Ahead lay a future bright with promise, filled with the laughter that had first illuminated his darkened barn and continued now to light every corner of his once lonely existence.